December 15, 1944. German town Schmidtheim. The earth was frozen. Under Oberreiter Hans Miller, the ground shook as a line of Panzer tanks moved west through the dark. He watched the endless line of armor fade into the Eiffel forests from the back of a half-track. They were going to strike tomorrow. Tomorrow, Germany would change the way they war. The Reich would show the world tomorrow that it still had what it took to win. He held a pen in his numb hands and hovered over his notebook, writing words that would have got him killed if they were found by and his guards. People tell us that this assault will split the Allies and force them to talk peace. I really want to believe this. I really want to believe in God, but I have seen what we face. From above, I've seen our cities burn. Now we're marching into barely enough gas to get to the Meuse, let alone Antwerp. The math doesn't make sense. And somewhere, every man here knows it deep down. Along a 75mm front that goes from Mona, over 200,000 German forces got ready for what Adolf Hitler had planned. Named the Rhine, Unanimous Operation Watch. The name itself was a lie because it made defensive actions along Germany's western border look like they were happening. The Wehrmacht's last frantic attempt to change the course of World War II was kept secret. The plan was so risky that it was dangerous. Make believe. 3 armies would break through American lines in the Ardennes forest that were only barely holding on, cross the drive 100 miles to Antwerp, where you will split into British and American groups, forces, and making the West discuss a peace deal. This would let Germany put all of your leftover power against the Soviet armies that are moving eastward. Leaders in the field who heard. When Hitler presented the plan in the middle of November, everyone was shocked into silence. The Führer had planned the whole operation himself, ignoring General Feldmarschallgeneral von Rundt's concerns, and it's called defeatism by General Feldmarschall Walter Model. Soldier also, General D'Anza. Von Manteuffel, who was in charge of the 5th Panzer Army, had been to the Wolf's Den for the planning meetings with. Fear is growing. He had been on the Eastern Front before, where his tank units had fought off many Soviet offensives. Manteuffel knew how to fight in armed battles because he was smart and mobile, better than maybe any leader in the German army. He knew what was needed for this mission and who Germany was. No longer had the means to carry it out. When Toll met Hitler alone on December 2nd, he had carefully laid out his worries. The attack needed a surprise, which was a good thing. The weather to keep Allied planes from flying, the fast progress to stop American reinforcements, and most importantly, the capture American fuel depots because the German supplies were barely enough to keep the opening push going. Not having all of these, even if everything worked out perfectly, the attack would fail. Hitler had brushed off these concerns. By waving his hand, he insisted that the German soldiers' strong will and fighting spirit would win over any material. Pros and cons. What Hitler wouldn't admit was that stronger will couldn't move things. Tanks without gas couldn't make gunpowder and couldn't take the place of the 800 planes and 1,500 tanks. Germany would agree to a plan that only had a 10% chance of working. The group that came together for Vactum Reign stood for Germany's last military reserve, the army of Panzer VI. Isef Dietrich would lead the main push in the north, going past Liege and ending up in Antwerp as part of the SS Obergruppenführer. Even though Dietrich was in charge of Germany's strongest armored force, he had never shown that he was good at the level of work. Since the beginning of the party, Hitler has liked Dietrich and thought he was a loyal Nazi. Worked their way up the ranks by being reliable in politics instead of being good at fighting. In private, General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt called him good but stupid, and Model had fought against being appointed. To no avail. Manteuffel would lead the 5th Panzer Army that would attack through the middle. They turned north to meet Dietrich's troops, and then went toward Bastonia and Namur. General D'Anza is to the south. Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would protect the southern flank of the assault with infantry divisions that were not mobile enough or had enough weapons to do more than slow down American counterattacks. The stats looked great on paper. More than 400,000 guys would take part in different steps of the offensive. About 1,400 tanks and attack vehicles, 1,000 battle planes, 2,600 guns, and 2,600 pieces of artillery had been scraped. People from all over the Reich came together. However, these numbers hid very serious flaws. Many Out of the 30 divisions that were sent on the attack, some were rebuilt formations full of teenagers and men over 40 who had got very little training. Even though the Panzer divisions had powerful Tiger and Panther tanks, not enough support cars, spare parts, and most importantly, fuel. Officers on staff thought that the attack had enough fuel to move 30 to 40 miles. It was 80 miles away from the Meuse River, from where they started. Antwerp was 125 miles away. The plan worked. During the first days of the assault, they relied on capturing American fuel dumps whole. What if the Americans? If you destroyed their supplies, the whole German armored spearhead would stop in the middle of enemy land. The lying had been superb. Radio silence, moving at night, and the code name that suggested defensive tactics had kept Allied intelligence from finding the huge buildup. American leaders thought Germany couldn't launch a major offensive attack at this point in the war, for new soldiers were in charge of the Ardennes sector, where the assault would start, or worn-out units that were resting in what soldiers called the Ghost Front. But Lion Surprise could only get the attack so far. Every field in Germany leader knew that once the attack started, they would have to hurry as more Americans arrived to help. Spilled into the forest. The 16th of December was cold and foggy when it started. Across the forest, right on time at 5:30 in the morning, 1,600 German troops. Pieces came out all at once in a 90-minute barrage that broke the winter silence. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann had been in Soviet lands while leading a Panzer IV tank in the 2nd Panzer Division. On the Eastern Front, there were artillery barges that made this assault look small. But he was grimly pleased as he saw the American lines fall apart under the shell fire. They might have been. Not right. It could be enough to just shock and hurt them. His tank jerked. As the infantry attack wave spread out, they moved forward. A lot of panzers were behind him, rolled toward Belgium, their engines screaming through the fog of early morning. Zimmermann looked at his fuel in the gun. Gauge was 3/4 full, which was enough to reach the idea if they moved quickly. If everything went as planned, they didn't run into any problems. Each truck in. The column knew this morning that it had to do some hard work. The attack in the north by the 6th Panzer Army ran into trouble right away. Here at Landsrath, there was only one American reconnaissance unit. With help from artillery, observers held up a whole German parachute company for 10 hours. When SS Oberto Bannführer Johann Piper, who was in charge of KF Gruppe Piper, when the most powerful armored battle group of the 6th Army got to Landsrath that night, he found the paratroops still there, held down. Piper was 29 years old and had been a troublemaker for Heinrich Himmler before, had a bad name for using heavy armor in offensive ways on the Eastern Front. She is tall, blonde, and dedicated to. Piper was in charge of about 4,800 men in the SS, 117 tanks, and many other vehicles. Vehicles that help. The orders he gave were easy. Break through the American barriers and keep going until you hit the Meuse. He took bridges before they could be destroyed, not caring about his sides. He was at the top of the chain of command. His success or failure would decide the fate of the whole assault. Piper was so angry about the delay that he sent his tanks forward at midnight and led the column himself. His camp grouper. As it got dark, the car went through narrow forest roads with engine noise booming through valleys. Piper was supposed to get to the Meuse in 12 hours according to the strike plan. His plans were already 6 hours behind, and not yet gotten free of the defenses of the United States. Piper's tanks beat American ones at Hansfeld. Positions, taking over cars, supplies, and a lot of prisoners. The U.S. people. They were completely caught off guard. Some were even still sleeping when German tanks rolled into their bivouac areas. Piper only stopped to fill at American dumps that it had taken over before continuing west. He had long towers that went for miles. Through the dark forest, a steel river moving toward the Meuse. But huge traffic jams happened on small roads that were meant for farm vehicles, not armored vehicles. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and guns that moved themselves were stuck in line for hours, leaving the engine to idle in the cold wastes valuable fuel. On December 17th, at a fork in the road near outside of Malmö, in Bonnier, members of KM Gruppe Piper ran into an American. A group of vehicles from Battery B285 Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After a short battle, the Americans gave up. The offensive would never forget what happened next, and no, a quarter would be given. About 120 Americans were rounded up by German SS men. They put the prisoners in a field and started firing with machine guns. The people who lived the first round of fire and tried to get away, but they were caught and shot. Men who were hurt were killed with gunshots to the head. 84 Americans were dead in the snow when it was over. The news of the massacre quickly spread through American groups, turning shock and confusion into cold anger. American soldiers who were ready to give up when the Germans attacked in large numbers now fought with them. Terrible fury. The massacre at Malmö changed the nature of the fight and made sure the Americans would win. Do not give up ground freely. It is in Mandel's 5th Panzer Army area that, at first, the attack had more success. Mandel had made a good case for striking without first firing artillery, which gave them an even bigger surprise. His troops broke through the 106th Infantry Division's lines and surrounded 2 whole companies. Over the next few days, almost 9,000 American troops gave up, the largest group of U.S. troops to give up in the theater in Europe. Montrefel's tanks sped toward the important road intersections of Sungvith and Bastonia are the most important roads in Ardennes. If these places were to fall, as soon as they started moving toward the Meuse, nothing could stop them. Dear Obus Minrad von Lau, in charge of the 2nd Panzer Division, he recklessly sped his tanks forward. His lead parts got around. While his panzers pushed deeper into Belgium, he left the American strong points for the troops that would come after. On the map sat 5th Army headquarters. The entry looked like it would be a sure thing. In some areas, the German troops had moved up to 20 miles. It looked like the American lines were giving way. In a split second, it looked like Hitler's risk might pay off. It might work. However, Lieutenant Friedrich Ratka, a veteran panzer soldier, stood and watched. He looked at the Panther tank's fuel gauge with rising worry. They had gone 15 miles and used up half of their fuel already. Cross-country wasn't possible because the small roads went through thick forests. Movement, every shortcut and route to avoid bridges that were already damaged took more time. Gasoline. His group went on the attack with 22 tanks. 3 had broke down because of mechanical issues, lack of upkeep, and engines that are too old. German business was. They made great tanks, but they didn't have enough spare parts to keep them going. Ratka's team knew what to expect. They took over American fuel dumps that were in their way. They had only come across destroyed supply points on their way back. Before they fell back, the Americans set everything on fire. It was getting easier to understand the numbers. They would at this rate. Between St. Vith and the Meuse, they ran out of fuel. Tanks without fuel were nothing more than steel tombs, awaiting an American plane. The weather, which was Germany's biggest friend, started to move on December 18th. Allied planes had to land because of fog and clouds. The forces began to weaken. Fighter bombers from the United States flew over the battleground, attacking German troops in a very destructive way. Hauptmann Hans Schmidt, who was in charge of a group of Panzer grenades, he saw P-47 Thunderbolts tear through his ranks and destroy 3. In seconds, they had trucks and a half-track. The fighters showed up out of the blue, diving through gaps in the clouds to launch bombs and cannons, and then climb back into the clouds. German troops had almost no way to defend themselves against planes. There was a Luftwaffe. Fighter backup was promised, but not many German planes showed up. A lot of Germany's. The last few planes were held back to help with a different operation, and combat flights were limited by a lack of fuel. More and more often, American planes showed up, setting German cars on fire on the roads. The progress slowed down many times as units hid and waited for the fighters to pass. With American ships all around it, Piper's camp grouper had come to a stop at Lays. Forces and no fuel left at all. Piper has gone from 4,800 men and 117 tanks to commanded less than 800 troops and 25 armored vehicles that were stuck because they were empty. Tanks for fuel. The village was constantly hit by American gunfire. American infantry and tanks made the trap tighter. On December 22nd, Lufthansa sent a resupply. The drop was supposed to bring fuel and weapons to Piper's trapped troops, who were spread out across the countryside. 90% of the goods that were falling outside of German lines. Piper sent out a radio message asking for permission to escape on foot, leaving his having cars. It was sent up the chain of command to Dietrich, who then sent it to Hitler. The answer came. Come back the next day. Stay where you are. More help is on the way. But Piper was sure that no help would show up. Every way in was blocked by American troops. His men were having food. Their very last food. Soldiers who were hurt were kept in cells and didn't get much medical care. In the evening of December 23rd, Piper chose to quit without permission. That night, 800 survivors left their tanks and other vehicles and sneaked through American lines on foot to get to German places after a few days. It had Camp Grouper Piper, which was the most powerful armored formation in the assault, have been destroyed without gaining any strategic goals. The design went all the way across the front. At St. With this, the American troops held out for a lot longer than the Germans had planned, blocking off important road intersections until December 21st. Elsenborn Ridge is where the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions made a solid northern shoulder that the 6th Panzer went through. Army into tight valleys, where American artillery killed German soldiers who were trying to break through. That is, the 101st Airborne Division got to Bastonia just before the Germans did. Grab the town and turn it into a fortress that could handle any attack. In general, Lieutenant Heinrich Freiherr von Lettwitz, who was in charge of the 47th Panzer Corps, sent a give the American leader until December 22nd to surrender. The Battle of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. One-word answer went into military lore. Nuts. When German officers asked what it meant, they were told it meant, go to hell. It was the 101st Airborne hold Bastonia until Christmas, while Montel's panzers tried to get around town and keep going west. But the roads, the supply and reinforcement lines that went out from Bastonia were very important. Without being able to control the town, German forces, they couldn't keep moving westward. Germany had planned for bad weather on December 24th. Feared. For the first time in a week, the Aransons woke up to clear skies. Within hours, the sky was full of Allied planes. That led to more than 5,000 flights. Day, hitting German supply lines hard and striking tank formations that had stopped, dropping supplies on American troops that are surrounded. Feldwebel Karl Meyer, in charge. A group of Tiger tanks stood helpless and watched as P-47 fighter planes flew overhead. Slowly destroyed his supply convoy. Without weapons, his Tigers were not useful. They couldn't move without fuel. Fighter pilots in the U.S. had learned to go after fuel cars first, because they knew they could deal with German tanks later when they were no longer moving. Meyer's unit, which had 45 Tigers when it started the attack, was now only 19 strong. Cars used for work. The rest had been left behind because they ran out of fuel, were destroyed by air attacks, or were knocked out in close combat. Fighting in a quarter. The Tiger, which was Germany's strongest tank, had protection that could stop most American tank rounds and an 88mm gun that could, taking out any Allied car from a long distance. But none of that mattered when the tanks were still and their fuel was empty. American fighter planes flew around like vultures above, leaving the tanks empty. The assault had reached its peak by December 25th. Some parts of the 2nd Panzer Division had pushed as far as the Meuse River, which is about 4 miles away near Dinant. This was the greatest German penetration. It was trapped, cut off, and out of fuel, though. In the north, British tanks of the XXX Corps strongly held the Meuse crosses. In the south, Patton's Third Army had left its posts in Lorraine, turned 90 degrees north, and then crash into the southern edge of the German salient. Germany was in a bad spot because of the weather. American artillery spotters fired heavy artillery at German sites that can be seen from everywhere. The operations of the Allies worked with thousands of tons of goods every day with machine-like efficiency, while German supply columns burned under attack from the air. The name of the fight comes from the Bulge that had grown to its fullest size. There were now going to be close it up by pressing on it. Otto Krebs, a man who had led a Panzer Grenadier company during the first few days of the attack, sat in a cold foxhole near Bastonia on Christmas Day and tried to figure out what went wrong. They had completely caught them off guard. They had gotten through U.S. lines. In some areas, they had moved up to 30 miles, but they still failed. The Americans had not given up. Every little town turned into a fortress. Every intersection is a battleground. His business had begun. With 160 men, 48 was still useful in battle. The rest were either dead or hurt, or not there. Their mortars were empty. They only had enough shots for one more battle, and they didn't have any more. chance of getting more supplies because American planes controlled the roads. For Christmas dinner, we had weak coffee and frozen bread. Krebs could hear American artillery fire at the same time, constantly, with shells coming from a logistics network that never seemed to end. He had fought on the front in the East. He had seen how the Soviets' huge offensives crushed German positions with their raw power, numbers and things. This was different. The Americans fought precisely, and they worked together to do so. That the Soviets never got: troops, armor, artillery, and planes. And they did it while making sure their men were fed, had the right gear, and had help from a logistics system that didn't work. Believe. At German command, the truth of failure slowly crept in. Many levels of denial. Model and von Rundert asked for approval over and over again to pull back, so that the American counterattacks don't surround and kill the whole German force. Hitler said no. He told the commanders to attack the Meuse again, saying that success was still possible if they showed enough. To be determined. Patrick's 4th Armored Division broke through on December 26th. Bastonia, making a way into the encircled town. The Americans right away began sending more troops and supplies to Bastonia, turning it from a defensive post into a base for strikes back. Montal's troops had skipped over Bastonia because they thought it only had the small base now faced a stronger American strongpoint in the back, which put their supply lines at risk, blocking the escape routes they needed. On January 1st, 1945, the last big action of the war for Luftwaffe was Action Bodenplatte. More than 900 surprise strikes by German planes destroyed many Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. There are 200 Allied planes on the ground. It looked like Germany could still win for a while. Hit hard, but the action had been a disaster from a strategic point of view. The Luftwaffe lost about 280 planes, and more than 230 were destroyed. Pilots who were killed, missing, captured, or hurt, including wing leaders, squadron leaders, and skilled pilots who can't be replaced. When the Allies lost planes, they got new ones. In a few days, Germany would never get back the pilots or planes that were lost in the attack that killed the Luftwaffe. Against itself, get rid of German fighter Johannes Steinhoff, who had one of the best scores. As the losses became clear, the pilots watched with increased horror as the planes came back to land. The Luftwaffe took a chance. Everything on one move and lost it all. From now on, German forces. They would fight without much air support while Allied fighter planes chased them nonstop. The German attack made a bulge 60 miles wide and 40 miles deep at its base. But it hadn't reached any of its major goals. The Allies still had control of the Meuse. Antwerp was not in danger. Their forces had not been split up or surrounded. It was very important that the offensive used up all of Germany's last strategic stocks of soldiers, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. Every Panzer company that was sent to the Ardennes was pretty much wiped out as a fighting force. Replacements did not exist. There were not enough new tanks that could be made. Reserves of fuel were worn out. Supplies that had been built up over months were used up in the attack. Things that Germany could never get back. The U.S. began major counterattacks on January 3rd. They were coming from the north and south to try to cut off the Bulge and trap the German troops inside. Hitler finally gave the order. On January 8th, with a limited departure, but by then, the chance for an organized. The escape was over. Under constant pressure, the German troops fell back. As American troops hit them from the air and the ground, they did desperate rear guard actions. Captain Hans Baer, tank commander in the 9th Panzer Division, wrote about the last few days of the attack in letters that were never sent. After he died in February 1945, among his things, "We're breaking down our own cars for not enough fuel to move. Every road is clogged with broken-down machinery. The Americans are after us day and night. Their planes show up whenever the weather is nice, and their artillery is right behind us." With eerie truth, we went on the attack because we thought we could change the outcome of the war. Now we only fight to get out of the trap we set for ourselves. The men aren't talking about winning anymore. They only talk about getting to find a safe place to hide from the American bombs and shells, and somehow make it through what we all did. To understand is to start the end. We put all of our money on the Ardennes, and we've lost. Germany doesn't have any more oil, fuel, or stocks. Illusions. Russia is coming from the east, and the US and UK are coming from the west. And we've spent all of our energy on one last attack that didn't work and only sped up our own loss and damage. The Germans were pushed back to their positions for starting. It was over with the Battle of the Bulge. The numbers showed that the story of a terrible failure. Germany sent about 400,000 men to fight in. On the attack, around 80,000 to 100,000 people were killed, hurt, or went missing. About 12,000 people were killed. The Germans lost 600 tanks and an attack weapons and cars that could never be replaced. The Luftwaffe lost a lot of planes and pilots who can't be replaced. German fuel reserves that had been building up for months were completely used up, worn out. The artillery ammunition that had been carefully saved for the offensive was gone. The attack had eaten up Germany's ability to carry out major operations. Germany would never attack on such a large scale again. The Americans lost about 81,000 people, including 19,000 who were killed. But, unlike Germany, America could replace these losses. Ships from America arrived daily with fresh divisions, new equipment, and endless supplies. The American dead would be mourned, but their loss would not American military operations. Germany's dead, wounded, and captured represented losses that could never be made good. More significant than the immediate casualties was the strategic cost. The offensive delayed Allied plans to cross the Rhine by approximately 6 weeks, but it also delayed Soviet operations in the east as Stalin had launched a massive winter offensive on January 12, forcing Germany to shift reinforcements eastward at the moment when they were most needed to defend the Ardennes. Hitler had gambled that a decisive victory in the West would allow Germany to concentrate against the Soviets. Instead, the Ardennes-consumed forces desperately needed in the East while achieving nothing in the West. When the Soviets launched their Vistula-Oder offensive, they encountered weakened German defenses and advanced 300 m in 3 weeks, reaching the Oder River less than 50 miles from Berlin. The Panzer divisions, destroyed in the Ardennes, could have slowed, though not stopped, this advance. Instead, they lay wrecked in Belgian forests, monuments to strategic delusion. Obus Hermann Gessner, who had commanded a Volk Grenadier Division in the offensive, wrote a detailed after-action report that was never submitted because by the time he finished writing it, there was no longer a functioning command structure to receive such reports. His analysis was brutally honest. The Ardennes offensive failed because it was based on assumptions that had no basis in reality. We assumed complete surprise, which we achieved. We assumed bad weather would ground Allied aircraft, which occurred for 1 week. We assumed rapid advance would prevent American reinforcement, which proved impossible on roads designed for farm traffic, not armored columns. We assumed captured American fuel would sustain our advance. But the Americans destroyed their supplies, or we could not reach them. We assumed American forces would collapse under the initial assault. Instead, even newly arrived divisions fought with determination that delayed our advance at every crossroads. We assumed our will to win would overcome material disadvantages, as if courage could be substituted for gasoline, determination could replace ammunition, and fighting spirit could overcome absolute Allied air superiority. Most fundamentally, we assumed that because Hitler ordered an offensive, that offensive must succeed. This was not military planning. This was magical thinking, and it has destroyed the last forces capable of defending Germany. The aftermath of the offensive brought consequences far beyond simple military defeat. The 6th Panzer Army, which had achieved so little in the Ardennes, was ordered to Hungary for a final offensive near Lake Balaton. This attack launched in March 1945 failed completely against Soviet defenses, and the 6th Panzer Army was effectively destroyed. Dietrich survived the war and was tried for war crimes at Malmö, receiving a life sentence that was later reduced. He was released from prison in 1955 and died in 1966, never acknowledging the massacre his forces committed. Piper was also convicted for war crimes at Malmö, initially sentenced to death, later reduced to life imprisonment, and released in 1956. He moved to France where he lived under an assumed name until 1976 when his identity was discovered. His house was firebombed and Piper was killed. The old massacre finally catching up with him 31 years after the events at Bonnier Crossroads. Manufel survived the war, surrendered to the British, and served a brief prison term. He later entered West German politics, serving in the Bundeswehr and coining the term Bundes for West Germany's new armed forces. He lectured at West Point about the Ardennes campaign, analyzing how American flexibility and logistics defeated German armored tactics. In interviews during the 1970s, Manteuffel was candid about the offensive's futility. From a purely military standpoint, the Ardennes attack made no sense. Germany lacked the resources to reach Antwerp. We lacked the fuel to sustain an advance beyond the MOS. We lacked the air power to protect our columns from Allied fighter bombers. We lacked the reserves to exploit any breakthrough we achieved. The offensive succeeded tactically in achieving surprise and breaking through American lines. It failed operationally because we could not sustain the advance. It failed strategically because even if we had reached Antwerp, which was impossible, such success would not have forced Allied negotiation or changed the war's fundamental outcome. Germany was already defeated. The Ardennes offensive simply accelerated the final collapse. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the difference between tactical proficiency and strategic reality. German soldiers fought with skill and determination throughout the offensive. German commanders executed complex operations under difficult conditions. German tank crews showed tactical superiority in individual engagements. None of it mattered because Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the logistics, and the resources to sustain offensive operations. The Americans had been surprised and badly hurt, but their response illustrated the power of material superiority and organizational depth. Within days, Eisenhower had shifted divisions across hundreds of miles, reorganized command structures, and concentrated overwhelming force against the German penetration. American logistics delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily. Despite winter weather and damaged roads, American industry replaced every lost tank, every destroyed truck, every expended artillery shell. The Battle of the Bulge was not won by superior American tactics or battlefield performance. In many engagements, German forces demonstrated higher tactical skill. The battle was won by American logistics, by industrial capacity that could absorb losses and replace them overnight, by an army that could shift corps-size formations hundreds of miles in response to crisis, and by complete air superiority that allowed American fighters to hunt German columns at will. For Germany, the Ardennes represented the death of strategic flexibility. After the offensive collapsed, the Wehrmacht fought purely defensive operations. The initiative passed completely to the Allies. In the east, Soviet armies advanced inexorably toward Berlin. In the west, American and British forces prepared to cross the Rhine. Germany's cities were systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. Oil production collapsed under air attack. Transportation networks disintegrated. Food supplies ran short. The industrial capacity that had sustained 4 years of war was crumbling. German soldiers no longer fought for victory. They fought to delay defeat, to keep Allied armies away from German cities for another day, another week, another month. They fought because the alternative was surrender, and they had been conditioned to believe surrender was betrayal. They fought because, despite everything, despite the destroyed cities and the millions dead and the complete hopelessness of their position, the Nazi regime still held Germany in its grip. And desertion meant death for the soldier and persecution for his family. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and consumed irreplaceable equipment, fuel, and ammunition. In return, Germany achieved nothing of strategic value. The offensive delayed Allied operations by 6 weeks. It forced the Western Allies to postpone their crossing of the Rhine from February to March 1945. That was the sum total of German achievement. For this delay, Germany sacrificed its last mobile reserves, ensuring that when the Allies finally crossed the Rhine, they encountered weakened defenses that collapsed rapidly. For this delay, Germany sacrificed panzer divisions desperately needed to defend against Soviet offensives in the east. For this delay, Germany consumed fuel reserves that might have powered a fighting withdrawal that could have prolonged resistance. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last gamble, and it was a catastrophic failure, perhaps the most expensive failure of the entire war, because it consumed resources Germany could not afford to lose in pursuit of objectives Germany could never achieve. Greer Paul Schmidt, who had participated in the opening assault as an infantryman in the 12th Volks Grenadier Division, survived the war and recorded his memories in the 1960s. His account captured the transformation German soldiers experienced during the offensive. We began with hope, bordering on euphoria. Finally, we were attacking again. Finally, we would strike a decisive blow against the Americans. The first days seemed to confirm our hopes. American units retreated. We advanced. We captured supplies and equipment. But by the fourth day, reality asserted itself. American resistance stiffened. American artillery fire increased. American counterattacks drove us from positions we had taken. And always when the weather cleared came the aircraft. Day after day, American fighters attacked our columns. They destroyed our supply trucks, our fuel transports, our ammunition carriers. Without supplies, we could not advance. Without fuel, our tanks sat motionless. By Christmas, we understood that the offensive had failed. By New Year's, we understood we would be lucky to escape back to Germany. When we finally withdrew in late January, our division had been destroyed. Of the men who attacked on December 16th, fewer than one-third returned to German lines. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. We had lost the war in the Ardennes, not because the Americans defeated us in battle, but because we defeated ourselves. We attacked with inadequate resources, impossible objectives, and delusional planning. And 50,000 German soldiers paid with their lives for this delusion. The German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes were not the same men who had conquered France in 1940 or driven deep into the Soviet Union in 1941. Many were teenagers with only weeks of training, thrown into combat equipped with outdated weapons. Others were men in their 40s pulled from factories and offices to fill depleted ranks. The elite SS divisions still contained combat veterans, but their ranks had been heavily diluted with young recruits who lacked experience. Equipment was a mixture of obsolete weapons, captured material from a dozen different nations, and German vehicles pressed into service despite mechanical unreliability. Logistics functioned poorly because Germany's transportation network was crumbling under air attack. The Wehrmacht that attacked in the Ardennes bore little resemblance to the powerful force that had dominated Europe 4 years earlier. This was an army of exhausted men, fighting with worn-out equipment sustained by increasingly unrealistic ideology and the desperate hope that, somehow against all evidence, Germany might yet avoid complete defeat. But some elements remained from Germany's earlier victories. German tactical doctrine still emphasized initiative at lower levels. Company and battalion commanders were expected to make decisions and exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from higher command. This flexibility had served Germany well in earlier campaigns. In the Ardennes, it allowed isolated units to continue attacking even when communications failed and when the overall offensive had clearly stalled. German tank crews remained highly skilled. The Tiger and Panther tanks, when they had fuel and ammunition, were superior to most Allied armor. German infantry units, when properly led and adequately supplied, fought with determination. None of this changed the strategic reality that Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win against enemies who possessed overwhelming material superiority. Tactical excellence and fighting spirit were insufficient when the enemy could absorb losses and replace them while Germany could not. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the ultimate bankruptcy of Nazi Germany's strategic position. Hitler's strategy since 1943 had been to inflict sufficient casualties on Germany's enemies that they would negotiate rather than continue fighting. This approach assumed that democracies were weak, that the Allies would crumble under losses, that British and American populations would demand peace once casualties mounted. Every aspect of this thinking proved wrong. The Allies were prepared to accept significant casualties to achieve complete German defeat. When American units were overrun in the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, American commanders responded by rushing reinforcements to contain the breakthrough, not by considering negotiation. When British tanks held the Meuse crossings, denying Germans their primary objective, The British government did not waver in commitment to Germany's unconditional surrender. The Allies understood what Hitler refused to accept. Germany had lost the capacity to alter the war's fundamental trajectory. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but when and at what cost. The Ardennes offensive added approximately 100,000 German casualties to the final bill without changing the answer to either question. What the offensive did accomplish was to eliminate any possibility of Germany negotiating a conditional surrender. The massacre at Malmö and other atrocities committed by SS forces during the offensive removed any sympathy Allied leaders might have felt for Germany. When Piper's forces gunned down American prisoners, when SS troops murdered Belgian civilians, when German forces committed systematic war crimes throughout their advance, they ensured that Allied demands for unconditional surrender and complete occupation would be non-negotiable. Germany would be defeated totally, occupied completely, and its leadership tried for war crimes. The Ardennes offensive made certain there would be no negotiated peace, no conditional surrender, no opportunity for Nazi leadership to escape justice. By February 1945, when the last German forces retreated to the Siegfried Line, the military situation was hopeless. In the east, Soviet armies had closed to within 60 miles of Berlin. In the west, American and British forces prepared to cross the Rhine in overwhelming strength. Germany's oil production had been reduced to almost nothing by air attack on synthetic fuel plants. German aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Tanks sat immobilized in defensive positions, unable to maneuver for lack of gasoline. German cities were systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Transportation networks were shattered. The economy was collapsing. Food supplies were inadequate. The Nazi regime controlled Germany through terror, executing soldiers for defeatism and hanging civilians suspected of doubting victory. Germany had become a nightmare state, fighting for its own destruction. Unable to surrender because the regime preferred to destroy Germany rather than admit defeat. Unable to win because victory had ceased to be possible. The soldiers who returned from the Ardennes carried with them the knowledge that Germany was finished. They had seen American material superiority firsthand. They had experienced the weight of Allied air power. They had understood the impossibility of defeating enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Some would fight on from loyalty to their units and comrades. Some fought because desertion meant execution. Some fought because the Nazi regime had destroyed their capacity for independent thought, conditioning them to follow orders regardless of consequences. But few fought, believing victory remained possible. The Ardennes had been Germany's final offensive effort. From February forward, Germany fought purely defensive battles, delaying actions, hopeless last stands in cities that would be destroyed defending them. The war would continue for 3 more months, but its outcome had been determined. Germany would be defeated, occupied, and divided. The Nazi regime would be destroyed, and millions more would die in the final battles, their deaths purchasing nothing except a brief delay of the inevitable. The Battle of the Bulge from the German perspective was a story of delusion, denial, and defeat. It was a story of soldiers sent to accomplish the impossible with inadequate resources by leaders who refused to accept reality. It was a story of tactical proficiency, wasted in pursuit of strategic impossibility. It was a story of courage and determination that produced no meaningful result except to hasten the destruction those qualities were meant to prevent. German soldiers in the Ardennes fought as well as any soldiers could be expected to fight under such circumstances. They achieved surprise, broke through enemy lines, advanced deep into Belgium, and inflicted significant casualties on American forces. None of it mattered because the fundamental strategic calculation was not right. Germany could not defeat the Allied coalition through military operations and lacked the resources for victory. The longer Germany fought, the more completely it would be destroyed. Every German soldier who died in the Ardennes died for nothing because the offensive could never achieve its objectives, and its failure guaranteed Germany's total defeat. The final accounting was brutal. Germany lost 100,000 men, 600 tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and irreplaceable quantities of fuel and ammunition. In return, Germany delayed Allied operations by 6 weeks and gained absolutely nothing of strategic value. The Ardennes offensive was a catastrophic failure, but it was more than military defeat. It was the death of the last German illusion that the war could still be won. After the Ardennes, even the most fanatical Nazi understood that Germany faced not just defeat, but destruction. The offensive consumed the last forces capable of delaying that destruction, ensuring that when the final collapse came, it would be swift and total. The Battle of the Bulge, from the German perspective, was the moment when Germany's fate was sealed, when hope died, when the illusion of possible victory finally shattered against the reality of absolute Allied material superiority. The German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes believed they were fighting for Germany's survival. Instead, they participated in an operation that guaranteed Germany's destruction, ordered by a regime that preferred total catastrophe to admitting error, launched against enemies whose overwhelming material advantages no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last offensive and its final failure. The moment when the mathematics of war proved that willpower and determination were insufficient substitutes for industrial capacity, logistics, and air superiority. From December 16, 1944, when the artillery began, to January 25, 1945, when the last German forces withdrew, Germany waged a battle it could not win, purchased a delay it could not afford, and consumed resources it could never replace. The result was inevitable: defeat, hastened by the very offensive designed to prevent it.